The old derelict church stood on the crest of a hill in Clophill, Bedfordshire, its skeletal frame silhouetted against the blood-red sky. Anna and her friends, Jake and Sophie, arrived at dusk, drawn by the church's dark history of desecration and whispered rumors of occult rituals. The air around them grew colder as they approached, their flashlights slicing through the thickening fog. As they crossed the threshold, the decayed wooden door creaked open on its own, groaning like a warning. Inside, the air was heavy with mildew and something else, an unshakable sense of dread. Exploring the church's nave, they discovered cryptic symbols etched into the crumbling walls. Jake, curious and defiant, traced his fingers over the markings. "What if this summons something?" Sophie joked nervously. Her voice echoed, but the echo didn't fade naturally. It seemed to murmur back. A distant shuffling noise came from beneath their feet. The trio froze as the stone floor seemed to vibrate faintly. "The crypt," Anna whispered, her voice trembling. A hidden staircase revealed itself under a loose slab. Against their better judgment, they descended into the darkness below. The crypt was suffocating, lit only by their flickering flashlights. Coffins, centuries old, lay cracked and open. "This isn't right," Sophie said, gripping Anna's arm. Just then, Jake's flashlight caught movement, a shadow darting across the wall. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice shaky. Silence, then a whisper. "Leave." The air turned icy, and the shadows seemed to grow, creeping toward them with unnatural speed. Sophie screamed as cold, claw-like hands brushed her shoulder. When they spun around, there was nothing there. Suddenly, the faint sound of chanting filled the crypt, a sinister melody of low, guttural voices. The friends backed against the wall, their breaths visible in the freezing air. In the center of the crypt, a figure emerged, a tall, robed silhouette with hollow eyes that glowed faintly red. Behind it, translucent apparitions began to rise from the open coffins, their faces twisted in eternal agony. The chanting grew louder as the robed figure raised a bony hand, pointing directly at Anna. "You should not have come here," it rasped, its voice like the grinding of stones. Panic overtook them as the walls seemed to close in and the apparitions advanced. Jake grabbed an ancient candlestick and swung it wildly, but it passed through the ghostly figures. Sophie tripped and fell, her screams swallowed by the cacophony. Anna grabbed her arm and pulled her up as Jake found a narrow passage leading to the surface. They sprinted through the tunnel, the echoes of their pursuers growing louder behind them. Reaching the exit, they burst into the open air, gasping for breath. Back at their car, they drove away in silence, too shaken to speak. As the church disappeared in the rearview mirror, Anna glanced at her reflection. Her blood turned to ice. Behind her in the back seat sat the robed figure, its hollow eyes glowing faintly red. The car's radio crackled to life, and the sinister chanting resumed. The screen faded to black with their screams, the sound of tires screeching, and the church's silhouette looming in the distance, a silent sentinel to the terror within. Anna's scream jolted the car off the narrow road. Jake swerved, narrowly missing an old tree. "What's wrong?" he shouted, his voice trembling. Anna turned around, but the back seat was empty. "It was there, the figure. It was there," she stammered. Sophie clutched Anna's arm. "We're losing it. That place messed with our heads," she whispered, though her wide eyes betrayed her doubt. The car radio crackled again, emitting faint whispers. "Turn it off," Jake yelled. But as his hand reached for the knob, the whispers grew louder, blending into laughter. The laughter turned to screams. Finally reaching Anna's house, they stumbled inside, locking the doors and turning on every light. They felt safe, at least temporarily. But as Sophie pulled up her sleeve to wipe her face, Anna gasped. Etched into Sophie's arm was a symbol, a match to the one Jake had traced in the church. "It's burning," Sophie whimpered, the skin around the mark turning black and blistered. Anna ran for a first aid kit, but Jake stopped her. "This isn't something you fix with bandages," he said grimly. "We brought something back with us." The house seemed to grow colder, and shadows lengthened unnaturally. Anna's dog Max barked frantically at empty corners. Lights flickered. The TV turned on by itself, showing static that slowly resolved into the crypt they had escaped. "This isn't possible," Jake whispered. On the screen, the robed figure appeared, staring directly at them. it raised its hand, and the lights in the house went out. The sound of chanting filled the room again, louder this time, and accompanied by the creak of footsteps on the wooden floor above. Desperate for answers, Jake retrieved his laptop and searched for the church's history. It was desecrated centuries ago by occultists, he explained. They performed rituals to summon something, but they never sealed it away. Sophie gasped as she found an old photograph of the robed figure. "That's it. That's what we saw," she said, pointing. A chilling realization hit them. The ritual wasn't finished, and by disturbing the site, they had unleashed something. "Maybe we can stop this," Anna said, steeling herself. They gathered what they could, candles, salt, and an old journal Jake had found with protective incantations, and drove back to the church. The journey was a nightmare. Their car headlights revealed fleeting shapes darting across the road, and the whispers in the radio refused to cease. When they arrived, the church seemed even more malevolent, its dark windows like hollow eyes. Inside, the symbols glowed faintly, and the chanting began as if welcoming their return. The crypt was now fully exposed, a gaping maw in the earth. Jake began the incantation, reading from the journal, while Anna and Sophie laid down a circle of salt. The robed figure emerged, larger than before, its hollow eyes blazing with fury. Shadows erupted from the walls, clawing at them. "Keep going," Anna shouted as Sophie lit the candles. The chanting grew deafening, drowning out Jake's voice. The robed figure stepped into the circle, ignoring the salt barrier. It reached for Jake, whose voice faltered as its cold hand gripped his throat. Sophie screamed and threw a candle at it, momentarily distracting the figure. Anna grabbed the journal and continued the incantation. The ground began to shake, and the apparitions shrieked as they were pulled toward the crypt, their forms disintegrating into smoke. The figure released Jake and turned to Anna, its hollow eyes locking onto hers. "You cannot undo what has been done," it hissed. The trio stumbled out of the church as dawn broke, the first rays of sunlight casting away the lingering shadows. They collapsed onto the grass, exhausted but alive. "It's over," Sophie whispered, though none of them felt convinced. As they drove away, Anna noticed her hand had stopped bleeding, but the mark of the church's symbol remained etched into her skin, faint but undeniable. As they passed a roadside mirror, the reflection of the back seat showed something that shouldn't have been there, a faint glowing pair of hollow eyes. The wind howled through the marshes of Lincolnshire as Ellie, Tom, and Sarah made their way to the abandoned St. Botolph's Church. The church was infamous for its sinister history, rituals, ghostly sightings, and whispers of dark forces that never left. It was Tom's idea to explore it at midnight, a test of bravery they couldn't back down from. The iron gates creaked loudly as they entered the graveyard, where gravestones leaned like forgotten sentinels. The storm above seemed to hold its breath as they approached the decaying structure. The air grew colder, and the feeling of being watched was impossible to shake. Inside, the church was a husk of its former self. Broken pews lay scattered, and moonlight filtered through shattered stained glass, casting eerie patterns on the floor. Ellie felt a chill as she touched the damp stone walls. Suddenly, a faint whisper echoed through the nave. "Did you hear that?" Sarah asked, clutching Tom's arm. "It's just the wind," Tom replied, but his voice betrayed his fear. The whisper came again, louder this time, and unmistakably human. "Leave," it seemed to say. A gust of wind slammed the heavy door shut, plunging them into silence. In the far corner, they found a hidden staircase leading to the crypt. "We shouldn't go down there," Ellie warned, but Tom was already descending, flashlight in hand. The crypt smelled of damp earth and decay. Rusted chains and old symbols carved into the stone suggested something darker than just forgotten graves. In the corner of the room, an old open book lay on a pedestal, its pages covered in strange, spidery writing. Sarah reached for it, but as her fingers brushed the page, the temperature plummeted. A deafening roar echoed through the crypt, and the shadows seemed to come alive. The shadows coalesced into a form, a tall, cloaked figure with glowing red eyes. It stood motionless for a moment, then pointed a skeletal hand at them. The room filled with whispers, each voice layered upon the other, chanting an incomprehensible hymn. "Run!" Tom screamed, dragging Sarah and Ellie back up the stairs. But the figure followed, its steps silent and unhurried. As they reached the nave, the shadows stretched across the walls, forming grotesque, writhing shapes. "It won't let us leave," Ellie cried, the heavy doors refusing to budge despite their desperate efforts. Near the altar, they found a circle of burnt candles and an animal's skull. "This is where they perform the rituals," Tom whispered, his voice trembling. As they stood there, the church seemed to come alive. The air pulsed with an unnatural energy, and the whispers grew louder, forming words. "Complete the offering." Ellie noticed her reflection in a fragment of stained glass. Behind her stood the shadow man, closer now, its breath cold against her neck. She screamed, and the others turned, but the figure was gone. Desperate for answers, Sarah flipped through the old book she had taken from the crypt. "It's a summoning ritual," she gasped, her hands shaking. "They summoned something centuries ago, and it's been trapped here ever since. It needs a soul to leave." The realization hit them like a hammer. "It's after one of us," Tom said grimly. The shadows began closing in, forcing them toward the altar. The shadow man reappeared, pointing at Ellie. "It wants me," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "No!" Tom shouted, stepping forward. "Take me instead." The shadow man paused, as if considering his offer. Ellie and Sarah screamed for him to stop, but Tom stepped into the circle of candles. The shadow man raised its skeletal hand, and the ground beneath Tom began to crack and split. Darkness enveloped him as he let out a final scream. The air grew still, the shadows retreated, and the figure disappeared. The church seemed to sigh, its oppressive energy lifting. Ellie and Sarah ran out of the church, the storm having calmed. They collapsed onto the wet grass, gasping for air. "He's gone," Ellie sobbed. They looked back at the church, its windows dark and empty. But as they walked away, a low whisper followed them. "One day, it will want more." Weeks later, Ellie sat alone in her room, staring at a framed photo of the three of them. The events of that night haunted her dreams. Suddenly, her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number appeared. "I'm still here. Tom." Her blood ran cold as the room darkened. In the corner, a tall shadow stretched across the wall, two glowing red eyes staring back at her. Ellie sat frozen, staring at her phone. The message from Tom replayed in her mind like a broken record. Her room felt colder, the air heavier, as though something unseen had joined her. A knock came at her door. She jumped. "Ellie, are you okay?" It was Sarah. Letting her in, Ellie shared the message, her voice shaking. Sarah stared at the screen, her expression darkening. "Ellie, I think whatever that thing was, it's not done with us." That night, Ellie dreamt of the church. She stood before the altar, her hands stained with blood. The shadow man loomed over her, whispering her name. She woke up screaming, sweat-soaked, only to find a single black feather on her pillow. Determined to find answers, Ellie and Sarah visited the town's library. They combed through old records and found an account of the church's desecration centuries ago. A farmer had stumbled upon a ritual and witnessed villagers offering their own to a being they called *Umbra Deus, the shadow god. The records ended abruptly, but a scribbled note warned, "It only rests. Disturbance awakens the hunger." Sarah's phone buzzed. A message from her own number read, "It's your turn." She gasped, showing Ellie. They realized with dread that whatever they had unleashed was tethered to them now. The strange occurrences worsened. Ellie found scratch marks on her walls, symbols matching those in the church. Sarah's reflection would linger in mirrors even after she turned away. At night, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed in their homes, though no one was there. The messages became more direct. "Return to me." They had no choice. They had to go back to St. Botolph's church. As they drove through the marshes, their car stalled. The engine sputtered and died. "Not now," Ellie muttered, hitting the steering wheel. The headlights flickered, and in their glow the shadow man appeared ahead on the road, motionless, waiting. Its presence seeped into the car like an icy fog. "Run," Sarah whispered, but Ellie couldn't move. Reaching the church on foot, they found the doors wide open, as if expecting them. Inside, the altar was restored, pristine and menacing. The book lay open, and the candles were newly lit, their flames flickering unnaturally. The Shadow Man appeared, its red eyes glowing with malice. "You returned," it rasped, its voice like grinding stone. "You disturbed my rest. Now you will feed my hunger." Ellie stepped forward, trembling but resolute. "Take me. Leave Sarah alone." The Shadow Man tilted its head as if amused. "I do not need permission," it said. The shadow surged forward, wrapping around Sarah, who screamed as they dragged her toward the altar. Ellie grabbed the book and read the incantation, her voice shaking. The Shadow Man recoiled, but the ground began to shake violently. Sarah writhed against the shadows binding her. "Finish it, Ellie," she cried. Ellie's voice grew stronger, the ancient words pouring from her lips. The Shadow Man let out an ear-piercing shriek, and the shadows exploded outward, sending Ellie flying across the room. The church grew still. The Shadow Man was gone, but so was Sarah. Ellie woke up outside, lying in the damp grass. The church was eerily silent, its windows dark and hollow. She called for Sarah, but there was no answer. Her phone buzzed. A single message appeared. Ellie drove home in silence, her hands shaking on the wheel. She knew the church wasn't finished. The Shadow Man wasn't finished. Every shadow she passed on the road seemed darker, alive, watching. When she arrived home, the lights flickered, and the black feather reappeared on her desk. Months later, Ellie moved to a new town, hoping to escape, but the nightmares continued. One night, she awoke to find her room pitch black. Her phone buzzed again. The message read, "It's time, asterisk." The lights flickered on, revealing Sarah standing in the corner. But it wasn't Sarah. Her eyes were empty, her face pale, and her lips curled into an unnatural smile. "Ellie," she whispered, "it never lets you go." The lights went out, and Ellie's scream was the last sound heard before silence claimed the night. Pluckley, Kent, a village known as the most haunted in England, was the perfect thrill for Matt, Lisa, and Alex. The trio of college friends visited St. Nicholas Church at midnight, lured by its legend of the Screaming Man, a restless spirit who, according to local lore, haunts the churchyard and bell tower. "Whoever stays until the bell tolls at 1 gets bragging rights," Alex dared, his voice cracking with nervous laughter. The fog rolled in thick, and the ancient church loomed ahead, its Gothic spire clawing at the moonlit sky. As they entered the graveyard, a low wail echoed, almost indistinguishable from the wind. Lisa shivered. "This place feels wrong." As they walked through the overgrown graveyard, their flashlights illuminated the names of the long dead carved into crumbling headstones. Lisa froze. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. The others stopped, listening. Faint whispers drifted on the wind, too soft to understand, but chilling nonetheless. Alex waved it off. Just the wind. But when he turned, one of the headstones was now clean and polished, the name on it glowing faintly, * Matthew Carter. "That's your name," Lisa said, backing away. Alex laughed nervously, claiming it was a coincidence. The whispers grew louder, turning into a low chant. Inside the church, the air was damp, and the smell of mildew and decay filled their nostrils. The floor creaked underfoot as they explored. Candles sat unlit on the altar, and cobwebs draped the pews like forgotten funeral shrouds. A large rusted bell rope hung ominously near the corner. "Let's get this over with," Alex muttered, sitting on a pew. The church suddenly fell silent. No wind, no creaks, just oppressive stillness. Then came the faint sound of footsteps above them in the bell tower. "No one else is here," Lisa whispered, gripping Matt's arm. "So who's up there?" Alex, ever the skeptic, grabbed his flashlight and headed toward the stairs leading to the bell tower. "Stay here if you're scared." Reluctantly, Lisa and Matt followed. The wooden steps groaned as they climbed, the air growing colder with each step. At the top, the bell swayed gently despite the still air. Standing beneath it was a figure, a man in tattered clothes, his face obscured by shadows. He turned slowly, revealing empty eye sockets and a gaping mouth. The trio froze in terror as the figure let out an ear-splitting scream, the sound reverberating through the tower like a banshee's wail. The group bolted down the stairs, but the church had changed. The pews were splintered, and the walls dripped with a dark, tar-like substance. Shadows darted across the room, and the air was thick with whispers and faint cries. The heavy door they had entered through was now shut tight, refusing to budge. Lisa screamed as cold, skeletal hands reached from the floorboards, clawing at her ankles. Matt pulled her free, and they stumbled toward the altar, the only place that seemed untouched. On the altar lay an old, leather-bound book, its cover inscribed with strange symbols. "This has to be the key," Matt said, flipping through the pages. The book detailed a ritual to banish the spirit of the screaming man, a victim of a wrongful execution centuries ago. As Alex read aloud the incantation, the candles on the altar burst into flames, illuminating the shadowy figure that now stood in the center of the nave. The screaming man's eyeless gaze bore into them, his scream building once again. The book revealed a terrible truth. The screaming man wasn't merely a ghost, he was a harbinger. By entering the church at midnight, they had become part of a ritual to summon something far worse. The chanting grew louder, and the floor split open, revealing a fiery pit. "We need to finish the incantation," Lisa shouted. But before Alex could continue, the book was ripped from his hands by an unseen force and thrown into the flames. The pit widened, and the screaming man reached for them. "It needs one of us," Matt realized with horror. "That's the only way to stop it." Alex shook his head violently. "No way! We all make it out!" But as the shadows closed in, Lisa stepped forward. "Go, I'll do it," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. Before the others could stop her, she leapt into the pit. The screaming man howled, and the ground sealed shut, silencing the chants and restoring the church to its original state. The heavy door swung open on its own, and Matt and Alex stumbled into the cold night air. The church was eerily quiet now, no whispers or screams, only the sound of the wind. They looked back, half expecting Lisa to follow, but the door closed behind them. "She's gone," Matt whispered, tears streaming down his face. "She saved us." Weeks later, Alex was packing for university when he noticed the framed photo of the three of them on his desk. Something was different. Lisa's face was missing, replaced by the faint outline of the screaming man. His phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number read, "I'm still here, asterisk." The lights flickered, and the room plunged into darkness as a faint scream echoed from somewhere deep within the house. Beverston St. Mary's Church was a picturesque sight by day, but the village whispered a darker truth about its history. Centuries ago, it was the site of a forbidden ritual that cursed the land. Lucy, Daniel, and Emma, amateur ghost hunters, were drawn to its sinister past. "This is it," Daniel said, adjusting his camera as they approached the ivy-clad church on a moonless night. The faint tolling of a bell, long thought broken, echoed through the air, though none of them could see the bell tower clearly in the dark. "Is this supposed to happen?" Emma asked nervously, clutching her flashlight. The church door creaked open as if inviting them in. Inside, the church was eerily preserved. Dust-coated pews stretched toward the altar, and faded stained glass windows cast distorted patterns on the stone floor. Emma's breath fogged the air, even though it wasn't cold. "It feels wrong," she whispered. As Daniel set up his camera, Lucy wandered toward a darkened corner where an ancient wooden confessional stood. Its door was slightly ajar. She felt a pull toward it, though every instinct screamed to stay away. When she peered inside, the confessional was empty, but a voice whispered, "Confess." She spun around, but no one was there. Suddenly, a low hum filled the church, growing into a ghostly chant. The trio froze as spectral figures appeared in the pews, their translucent forms dressed in tattered robes. They swayed in unison, singing a haunting melody in a language none of them understood. Daniel aimed his camera, but the screen showed nothing. "They're not real?" he muttered, stepping closer. One of the figures turned its head sharply toward him, its eyeless sockets bleeding shadows. The chant stopped abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence. The group stumbled toward the altar, where they noticed an old trap door, half hidden beneath a tattered rug. "It's not on the church map," Daniel said, pulling it open to reveal a stone staircase descending into darkness. Emma hesitated. "This is a terrible idea." But Lucy was already descending, her flashlight casting long, eerie shadows. The air grew colder the deeper they went, and the walls were carved with strange symbols. At the bottom, they entered a cavernous crypt. In the center stood a stone pedestal with a black pulsating book bound in chains. Curiosity overtook fear as Daniel reached for the book. The moment his fingers touched it, the chains snapped open, and the book fell to the ground, flipping its own pages. The symbols on the walls began to glow, and the chanting resumed, louder and more menacing. Emma screamed as a figure rose from the shadows, a tall, cloaked entity with a face that shifted between skeletal and human. It pointed at Lucy, its voice a guttural growl. "The keeper has returned." Lucy froze, her eyes glazing over as if entranced. Daniel grabbed Lucy's arm, shaking her, but she muttered in a voice not her own, "It must be completed." The entity raised its hands and the ground trembled. The crypt's walls began to crack, revealing more shadowy figures clawing their way out. "We have to stop this," Emma cried, searching for a way to escape. Daniel flipped through the book, desperate for answers, but the symbols shifted and blurred. The cloaked figure loomed closer, its hollow eyes fixed on Lucy. "She belongs to us now," it hissed. Realizing the book was the key, Daniel hurled it onto the pedestal and shouted for Lucy to help. "Fight it, Lucy," he pleaded. For a moment her eyes cleared, and she grabbed Daniel's hand. Together, they recited the words scrawled on the pedestal, their voices barely audible over the screams of the shadowy figures. The crypt filled with blinding light, and the cloaked entity let out a roar that shook the walls. The shadows were sucked back into the cracks, and the book burst into flames. The crypt grew silent, but Lucy collapsed, her body lifeless. Emma and Daniel carried Lucy's body out of the crypt, emerging into the cold dawn light. The church was eerily still, its haunting presence seemingly gone. "We did it," Daniel said shakily. But as they laid Lucy on the grass, her eyes opened. They were black as night, and her lips curled into a smile. "You can't destroy it," she whispered in a voice not her own. Her body dissolved into shadows, leaving nothing behind but the faint sound of laughter. Weeks later, Daniel and Emma tried to move on, but their nightmares were relentless. One day, Daniel received a package with no return address. Inside was a single page from the cursed book, its symbols glowing faintly. Scrawled at the bottom was a message: "The keeper always returns." That night, Emma's screams echoed through the village, and Daniel woke to find the blackened form of Lucy standing at the foot of his bed, her shadow stretching to engulf him. On a chilly autumn night, Sam, Chloe, and Nathan arrived at the abandoned St. Andrew's Church in Walpole, St. Andrew. The church had been closed for decades after a fire gutted its interior, but locals claimed something darker had been the true cause. Rumors spoke of ghostly monks, shadowy figures, and a cursed bell that tolled without warning. "It's just a story," Nathan said, though his voice wavered. The friends had come on a dare to spend the night inside the church. The moon hung low, casting the crumbling spire in an eerie light. As they pushed open the heavy, scorched doors, a gust of cold air greeted them, carrying the faint scent of smoke. Inside, the church was a ruin of charred wood and collapsed stone. Dust swirled in the air, illuminated by their flashlights. Chloe shivered. "It feels like we're being watched," she said. The others laughed nervously, but the silence was deafening. As they explored the nave, Sam froze. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. A faint murmur, like voices praying, drifted from the altar. They moved closer, their footsteps echoing ominously. The sound stopped, and the church grew colder. Nathan brushed off the unease. "Just the wind," he said, but even he avoided looking at the shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally. Behind the altar, they discovered a trap door hidden beneath a tattered rug. "This isn't on the blueprints," Chloe said, her voice tight. The door creaked open to reveal stone steps descending into darkness. "Let's check it out," Nathan said, though his bravado felt forced. The crypt was damp and cold, its walls lined with niches holding broken relics and decayed bones. In the center of the room was a large stone table, etched with strange symbols that glowed faintly. Chloe reached for her phone to snap a picture, but it died instantly. "Something doesn't want us here," she whispered. As they examined the table, a shadow darted across the room. "What was that?" Sam asked, his voice cracking. A figure emerged from the darkness, clad in tattered monk's robes. Its face was a hollow void, and its hands stretched unnaturally long, tipped with sharp blackened nails. The figure pointed at them, and the murmuring from earlier returned, louder and more menacing. "We need to go," Chloe said, backing toward the stairs. But the trapdoor slammed shut above them, trapping them in the crypt. The figure glided closer, its hollow face tilting as if studying them. Above them, the church bell began to toll, though it had been destroyed in the fire decades ago. Each chime seemed to shake the crypt, and the symbols on the table pulsed with light. The monk raised its hand, and the bones lining the walls began to move, forming skeletal shapes that surrounded the trio. Sam grabbed a loose piece of stone and swung at one of the skeletons, but it shattered and reformed instantly. The monk's voice echoed in the chamber, chanting in Latin, "Exsurgat maledictus, non relinquetur vivus." Chloe screamed, clutching her ears as blood trickled from them. Nathan spotted a leather-bound book on the stone table, its cover inscribed with the same glowing symbols. "It's the source," he shouted. He grabbed the book and the monk screeched, its voice a mix of rage and agony. The room erupted in chaos as the skeletons lunged. Nathan flipped through the book, finding a passage that seemed like a banishment spell. "Read it," Sam yelled, holding back one of the skeletal figures with a broken bone. Nathan's voice shook as he read the incantation, the words causing the monk to falter and the skeletons to crumble. The bell stopped tolling, and the crypt fell silent. Above them, the church bell began to toll, though it had been destroyed in the fire decades ago. Each chime seemed to shake the crypt, and the symbols on the table pulsed with light. The monk raised its hand, and the bones lining the walls began to move, forming skeletal shapes that surrounded the trio. Sam grabbed a loose piece of stone and swung at one of the skeletons, but it shattered and reformed instantly. The monk's voice echoed in the chamber, chanting in Latin, "Exsurgat maledictus, non relinquetur vivus." Chloe screamed, clutching her ears as blood trickled from them. Nathan spotted a leather-bound book on the stone table, its cover inscribed with the same glowing symbols. "It's the source," he shouted. He grabbed the book and the monk screeched, its voice a mix of rage and agony. The room erupted in chaos as the skeletons lunged. Nathan flipped through the book, finding a passage that seemed like a banishment spell. "Read it," Sam yelled, holding back one of the skeletal figures with a broken bone. Nathan's voice shook as he read the incantation, the words causing the monk to falter and the skeletons to crumble. The bell stopped tolling, and the crypt fell silent. Thank you for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe.